I want to start by admitting the thing I've spent 2 years refusing to say out loud, which is that the bunker was never really about the end of the world. I told everyone it was. I told my brother it was insurance, told my coworkers it was a hobby, told myself it was preparation. The truth, the one I can only confess now with a headlamp dying beside me and the wind pushing dirt through a seam that should have been sealed, is that I built a hole in the ground because I wanted an excuse to stop answering people. $38,000 to be unreachable. That was the real invoice. My name is Marchus Deel, and until the 11th of that month, I was a soil remediation surveyor, which meant I spent my days reading dirt the way other men read stock tickers. I could tell you where water would pool, where a foundation would crack, where a slope wanted to slide. It was quiet, unglamorous work, and it made me the only man in my county who understood exactly how to hide something underground and keep it dry. That skill built the bunker. That skill I'd learn would also become the thing I couldn't outrun. The excavation crew left on a Tuesday. I remember the foreman, a broad man named Pick. Everyone called Silas Reyes Pick because he'd been swinging one since he was 14, standing at the lip of my access hatch with his hands on his hips, squinting down at the poured concrete like it offended him. "You know what this looks like from up here, Marcus," he said. "Looks like a grave you're real proud of." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't smiling. Silas had a daughter, Nadia, 17 and sharp as broken glass, who sometimes rode along on his jobs when school let out early. She'd been sitting on the tailgate that whole afternoon, earbuds in, sketching the tree line in a battered notebook. When her father said the thing about the grave, she looked up at me over the top of her sketch pad with an expression I couldn't read then and understand completely now. It was the look of someone doing math about a stranger, deciding whether he was the kind of man worth remembering. I paid Silas the final balance in cash because I liked the theater of it. Liked feeling like a man who'd taken his fate into his own hands. He counted it twice, folded it into his jacket, and said the last full sentence he'd ever say to me before everything changed. "Whatever you're hiding from up here, it's still going to be up here when you climb back out." Then he loaded Nadia into the truck and drove off down the access road, gravel ticking against the wheel wells, and I stood alone at the mouth of the thing I'd bought. That night, I slept underground for the first time. I want to describe it honestly. It was not peaceful. The silence had a texture, a pressure against the eardrums, and the recirculated air tasted faintly of the epoxy I'd sealed the walls with. I lay on the cot, listening to my own heartbeat, amplified by the concrete, and felt, for the first time, not safe, but interred. I told myself it was adjustment. I told myself a lot of things in those days that turned out to be lies I needed. 5 days. That's the number the algorithm keeps pushing at people. And it's accurate, but numbers flatten things. 5 days is not a countdown when you're living inside it. It's just Wednesday, then Thursday, then a Friday when the bird stopped, which I noted and dismissed. A Saturday when my phone lost signal, and I felt a childish thrill instead of dread. And a Sunday when I climbed the access ladder to check my rain collection and found Silas's truck parked at the top of my road with both doors open and no one inside. I called his name. My voice went out across the empty field and came back thinner. The engine was still running. On the passenger seat, Nadia's notebook lay open to a fresh page, and on that page, in handwriting pressed so hard it had torn the paper, were 3 words that turned my expensive silence into something with teeth. Don't go home. I did not yet know what I was looking at. I only knew that a man who'd warned me the world would still be waiting had driven back to tell me it wouldn't, and had not stayed to explain. I stood in the wind with the notebook in my hands, and somewhere down in the tree line, something that used to walk like a person began to move toward the sound of my voice. The figure came out of the tree shadow at the far edge of the field, and my first instinct was relief, because a person meant an explanation. I raised my hand. I actually said, "Silas?" Like a fool, like the shape crossing the grass owed me clarity. It didn't answer. It didn't slow at the fence line the way a person slows, didn't lift a leg to step over the low wire, just walked into it and kept walking, folding the wire down with the dumb persistence of water finding a drain. That was the moment my body understood before my mind did. My legs had already turned me toward the hatch. I'd like to say I acted with the competence of a man who'd spent $38,000 preparing for exactly this. I didn't. I dropped the notebook. I climbed down the ladder too fast and tore the skin off 2 knuckles on the rung housing. And I hauled the hatch shut above me, with my heart trying to climb out of my throat. Through the steel, I heard it arrive at the top. Heard the wet, aimless dragging of hands over the cover. And I sat on the floor of my grave, listening to something try to find the seam of it. I need you to understand what I saw in the 2 seconds before I went down, because I've replayed it more times than I've slept. The face was Silas's foreman from another crew, a man I'd met exactly once, named Otto. I recognized the burn scar on his forearm, but the face wasn't doing any of the things a face does. No squint, no recognition, no fear. The eyes were tracking sound, not sight. It had turned toward my voice, not my movement. That single observation, filed away in the animal part of me while the rest of me panicked, would keep me alive longer than any wall I'd poured. I stayed underground for what my watch told me was 9 hours, and my nervous system told me was a week. The dragging stopped eventually. I did not trust that it had left. I sat with my back against the cold wall and did the thing I do, the only thing I've ever been good at, which is read a situation like soil. Otto tracked sound. Otto did not climb, did not problem solve, only pressed toward stimulus. If that held true for whatever he'd become, then noise was the enemy and stillness was a kind of camouflage. The bunker, I realized with a lurch, was the loudest quiet place imaginable. Every dropped can, every cough, every hum of the air scrubber was a beacon in a world that had gone silent enough to hear it. Around hour 6, I made myself do the inventory. Not out of some heroic discipline, but because counting things is what my hands do when my mind wants to run. I won't bore you with the arithmetic of a pantry, because that's a story other men tell, and I promised myself I won't tell theirs. What mattered wasn't the count. What mattered was the notebook I'd left up top, and the running truck, and the fact that a 17-year-old girl had written a warning to me specifically and then vanished. Somebody had known this was coming. Somebody had known where I was. And somebody had decided I was worth warning. When I finally cracked the hatch at the 9th hour, I did it wrong on purpose. I lifted it a half inch and waited, listening, letting the seam of daylight lie flat across the concrete like a blade. Nothing rushed it. I lifted it further. The field was empty. Otto was gone, or gone still somewhere I couldn't see, and Silas's truck had stopped running. Out of fuel, I guessed, its tank drained by a night of idle. The notebook was where I'd dropped it, its pages ruffling. I climbed out into a world that looked exactly like the one I'd left, which was the most frightening part. No smoke, no sirens, no cinematic ruin. Just a warm afternoon, and a field, and the terrible, ordinary quiet of a place where the birds had understood something before I did. I picked up the notebook, under "Don't Go Home." In that same torn paper pressure, Nadia had added a line I hadn't seen in my panic. A line that reframed everything and pointed me toward the choice that would break me. "We're at the school. Dad's hurt. You're the only one who can get under it. Under it." She knew what I was. She knew what I could do with dirt and foundations and the hidden bellies of buildings. And she was asking the one man who'd paid a fortune to never be needed again, to become, of all things, needed. I want to be honest about how long I stood at that truck arguing with myself, because the version of this story where I'm brave is a lie, and I'm done with lies. I stood there for the better part of an hour. I had a sealed, dry, defensible hole in the ground behind me, everything I'd designed my adult loneliness around. And in front of me, I had a torn notebook page and a 9-mile drive to a town I'd moved out here specifically to avoid. Every instinct I'd cultivated for 39 years told me to go back down the ladder and pull the world shut over my head. What changed my mind wasn't courage, it was the burn scar. I kept seeing Otto's forearm, that specific, human, remembered detail on a thing that no longer had a self. And I understood that going into the ground alone meant becoming that eventually. A body with a scar, and no one left who knew the story of it. Silas had been right at the lip of the hatch. I'd built a grave I was proud of. The notebook was the only thing in the world offering me a reason not to lie down in it. Silas's truck was dead, but mine wasn't. I kept an old diesel flatbed parked in the equipment shed, the one I hauled survey gear in. And diesel doesn't spark foul the way gas engines do when they sit. It coughed, caught, and idled rough. And the sound of it in that silence was so loud, I nearly killed the engine out of pure animal terror. Instead, I made myself think. Sound draws them. Then I would use sound the way I used water tables, not fight it, root it. I found a battery-powered radio in the gear locker, the kind with a hand crank, switched it to a dead station of pure static, and set it on the tailgate of Silas's dead truck, turned up as loud as it would go. Then I drove away slowly, watching the mirror, and I saw them come. 3, then 5, then more shapes peeling out of the tree line and the ditches, all of them turning toward the abandoned truck and its screaming static, none of them toward the diesel rumble already fading down the road. It worked. God help me, it worked. And I felt the specific nausea of a man who has just learned he's good at something he never wanted to be good at. The drive into town was 9 miles of evidence I didn't want to read. Cars and ditches, all of them pointed away from the county seat, all of them abandoned mid-flight. A church sign that still said, "Potluck Sunday." A dog, alive, running alongside the truck for half a mile before it gave up. I passed the turnoff to my own house, the house I'd left when the bunker was finished. And I remembered Nadia's warning, "Don't go home." And I obeyed it without knowing why. And that obedience, I'd learned later, was the only reason I lived to write this down. The school sat on the north edge of town, a low brick building from the 1960s with a flat roof and, crucially, a basement. I knew the basement existed because I'd surveyed the ground under it 4 years earlier for a bond issue that never passed. I knew the water table there ran high in spring and that the district had sealed an old coal cellar and a set of utility tunnels that connected the boiler room to the athletic building across the lot. Under it. That's what Nadia had written. She hadn't picked the school because it was safe. She'd picked it because she knew I carried a map of its hidden underside in my head. I parked behind the athletic building where the truck couldn't be seen from the main road, and I killed the engine and sat in the ticking quiet. And that was when I saw the face in the narrow window well of the athletic basement. A girl's face, pale, pressed to the dirty glass, mouthing something at me through 2 feet of earth and a pane of reinforced wire glass. Nadia. Alive. Behind her, movement, other shapes in the dark that might have been people or might have been the other thing. I couldn't tell. She pointed, urgently, down and to her left, at a spot in the weedy ground beside the foundation, where nothing marked the earth, but where I knew, because I'd drawn it myself. An old utility access ran 3 feet below the surface toward the boiler room. She was telling me the front doors were compromised. She was telling me the only way in was the way only I could find. And she was telling me, with her eyes, that whatever was in there with her didn't have long. I found the access exactly where my 4-year-old memory said it would be, which frightened me more than it comforted me, because it meant Nadia's faith in me had been correct, and now I had to earn it. The utility trench was capped with a concrete lid gone soft at the edges with age, and I levered it up with a pry bar from the truck, working the metal in slow, deliberate movements, terrified of the noise. Below the lid, the tunnel breathed out cold air and the smell of rust and standing water. It was a crawl space, not a corridor, maybe 30 inches high, running black into the dark toward the building. Before I went in, I made a decision I'm still not sure was right. I left the truck unlocked with the keys in it. If this went wrong, if I died in that tunnel, I wanted whoever came after, Nadia, if she got out somehow, to have a running vehicle. It was the first genuinely unselfish thing I'd done in years, and it felt less like generosity and more like writing a will. I clicked on my headlamp, lowered myself into the trench, and crawled into the underside of the school. The tunnel had been dug by men who assumed no one would ever be inside it, which meant it was honest in a way buildings above ground never are. Exposed pipe, weeping joints, a floor of silt and grit. I moved on my forearms, dragging my body toward the boiler room, and I counted my breaths to keep from thinking about the weight of the school pressing down through 30 inches of dirt. Halfway along, my headlamp caught something ahead that stopped my heart. A shape slumped against the tunnel wall where it widened near the boiler foundation. A person, not moving. I lay in the dark and watched it for a full minute before I understood it was alive, because the breathing was so shallow. A man, older, work clothes, one leg pinned at a wrong angle under a section of collapsed shelving that had fallen from the boiler room floor above. His eyes found my light, and he lifted one hand. Slow, palm out. The universal gesture that means, I am still a person, please. It was Silas. Pick. The foreman who'd warned me my bunker was a grave, dragged himself into the guts of a building to hide his wounded body from the sound-hunting dead, and waited in the dark to see if the man he'd warned would come. Nadia, he whispered, before anything else. Not help me, not water. His daughter's name. She's up top, in the wrestling room. There's 4 of us, and one of them got in through the gym doors before we sealed the stairwell. It's slow. It can't find the door in the dark, but if anybody makes noise... He stopped, breathing through the pain. You still read dirt, Marcus? I told him I did. I told him I'd built a whole life out of not needing anyone, and that the joke of the universe was that the one skill I'd developed to be alone was the only thing that could get us all out. He almost smiled. Then he told me the thing that turned this from a rescue into the choice I've never forgiven myself for making the way I made it. The utility tunnel had 2 branches. One went up into the boiler room, into the building, toward Nadia and the others, and toward the infected thing wandering the dark halls, drawn to any sound. The other branch, the one Silas had crawled down, ran the opposite way, toward a storm outfall that led out into the creek bed beyond the athletic field, away from the school, toward escape. Silas couldn't crawl any further. His leg was ruined. And he looked at me with his daughter's exact expression. The math-doing look I'd seen on the tailgate a lifetime ago. And he said, "You can only pull one person through this tunnel at a time. It'll take you 3 trips to get everyone out. Maybe 4 with me. The thing up there will hear us eventually. Start the count over in your head, surveyor. Who comes out first? And who's still inside when it finds the door?" I have built my confession around this sentence, so let me set it down cleanly. I was a man who had spent $38,000 to never again be responsible for another human being's survival, and I was now lying in a cold pipe under a school being handed the responsibility for 4 lives and 1 dying man, with a limit of 1 at a time and a monster in the dark that ran on the very sound we'd have to make to escape. Silas watched me understand it, and then he told me the order he wanted. And it was not the order that saved the most people. And I had to decide whether to obey a father or the arithmetic. Silas wanted his daughter out first. Of course he did. Any father would. But I lay there in the silt, with my headlamp painting his gray face, and I did the thing that makes me hard to like. The thing my ex-wife used to call clinical when she meant cruel. I disagreed with him on the math, and I said so out loud to a dying man. "If I take Nadia first," I said, keeping my voice under the register that carries, "I have to crawl her all the way to the outfall, then crawl all the way back. And every trip I make is another chance the thing upstairs finds the stairwell door. The person who comes out last is the one most likely to die. You want that to be the strongest of them, not the weakest, because the last one out might have to move fast in the dark alone." He stared at me. "Nadia's 17, and she's the calmest person in that room. You told me yourself she sealed the stairwell. She should come out last, not first." I watched him hate me for being right. It's a specific thing. Watching a father hate the truth, because the truth doesn't love his child the way he does. He closed his eyes. And then, because Silas Reyes was a better man than I have ever been, he said, "Ask her. Not tell her, ask her. Give the 17-year-old the vote her father couldn't stand to cast." So I crawled up into the boiler room, into the building, into the dark where a dead thing walked. The boiler room door was a hollow steel fire door. And I opened it a fraction and listened. And somewhere down the black hallway, I heard it. Not footsteps, exactly, but the drag and stutter of something that had forgotten how to walk on purpose. I froze. I let it move away. Then I went the other direction, toward the wrestling room, my hand trailing the cinder block wall, my headlamp off now because light was useless against a thing that hunted by ear, and I couldn't risk the glow bleeding under a door. The wrestling room door had been barricaded from inside with rolled mats. I scratched a pattern on it, 3-2-3, the rhythm of a knock too quiet to carry. And after a terrible pause, it scraped open 2 inches, and Nadia's eye appeared in the gap. When she saw me, something in her face broke and reset, relief and terror occupying the same features. Behind her, 3 others. A heavy-set man in a custodian's uniform named Doyle. A woman in her 60s named Ruth who taught chemistry and had the steadiest hands I'd meet in that whole nightmare. And a boy of maybe 10, mute with shock, named Eli, whose parents were not in that room and whose absence no one explained. I told them the situation in the fewest words I could. One at a time, the tunnel, the outfall, Silas alive but broken below, and the choice of order. When I got to the part about who goes last, Nadia didn't hesitate the way I'd expected her to. She looked at Eli, the 10-year-old, and then at Ruth with her steady hands, and then at Doyle, who was already sweating and shaking. And she said, "The kid first, then Ruth, then Doyle, then my dad, then me." She'd assigned herself last before I could argue for it. She'd done the same math I had, faster, and without the cover of pretending it was clinical. I want to record that Doyle objected. Doyle, the biggest and strongest, wanted out first. And he said the quiet part loud enough that I had to physically put my hand over my own mouth to keep from telling him to shut up. Because his voice was rising, and rising is death. Ruth put her steady hand on his arm and said, in a whisper that somehow carried more authority than any shout, "You'll go third. Marcus needs you strong for later, not gone early." She lied to him kindly, gave him a reason to feel important instead of afraid. And it worked. And I filed away another lesson. The truth isn't always the tool. Sometimes the tool is the story a frightened person can hold on to. I took Eli first. I strapped the boy to my back with a wrestling singlet knotted at the chest, told him to breathe against my neck and make no sound, no matter what. And I lowered us both into the tunnel. Behind me, I heard the mats scrape shut. Ahead of me lay 30 inches of dark and 100 feet of crawling. And somewhere in the building above, a thing that would hear us if the boy so much as cried. Eli's heartbeat drummed against my spine, fast as a bird's. And I started to crawl. And I understood that the next hour would define whatever was left of me. Eli didn't cry. That's the mercy I got. The one thing that broke my way. A 10-year-old boy so deep in shock that his silence, which had frightened his rescuers, became the thing that saved us. He clung to my back and breathed against my collar, and made no sound at all as I dragged us both toward Silas's slumped shape and then past it toward the outfall branch. Silas reached out as we passed and touched the boy's dangling foot. Just once. A benediction. And Eli's eyes found the wounded man's face, and something passed between them that I had no part in. The outfall was a corrugated pipe half-choked with old leaves, and it led out into a dry creek bed screened by brush, exactly where the district's drainage plans had promised it would be. I pushed Eli out into the daylight, and the boy blinked at the sky like he'd forgotten it existed. I told him to hide in the brush, to stay flat, to not move toward any sound, and to wait for the others. He nodded. Then, in the only words he spoke that entire day, he whispered, "My mom said hide and count to 100. I'm on 9,000. And he went into the brush, and I went back into the dark to keep my part of a promise I'd made to a girl who'd assigned herself to die last. I won't narrate every crawl, because the honest truth of that afternoon was repetition. And I promised myself this account wouldn't turn into a rhythm you can predict. So let me instead tell you the trip that mattered. The third one. The one where everything I thought I understood about the situation turned out to be wrong. I'd gotten Ruth out on the second trip, her steady hands finding purchase in the pipe where a younger person's would have slipped. On the third trip, I went back for Doyle, and Doyle was gone. Not dead, gone. The wrestling room door stood open 6 inches, the mats pushed aside, and inside there was only Nadia, pressed into a corner with a length of pipe in her hands and her eyes enormous in the dark. Doyle, it turned out, had not been able to wait for his turn. Somewhere between my second and third trip, Doyle had decided the tunnel was too slow and the building had another way out. And he'd unbarricaded the door and gone looking for it. And he had found, instead, the thing in the hallway. Nadia told me this in a whisper so thin I had to read half of it off her lips. She'd heard it happen. She'd heard Doyle's voice go from footsteps to a shout to something worse. and she'd re-barricaded the door alone in the dark with a dead man's weight of terror on her. And she'd waited because she trusted that I would come back, because her father had told her the surveyor keeps his promises even when the surveyor is a coward about everything else. Here is the thing that rearranged my understanding. Doyle's death had drawn the infected thing away, deep into the building, toward the noise of his ending. For one narrow window, the halls between us and the boiler room were empty. The monster had been lured, not by any plan of mine, but by the exact failure of the plan, by the one man who couldn't hold still. I had spent the whole afternoon congratulating myself on routing sound like water, and in the end, it wasn't my cleverness that opened the path. It was another person's panic, and his death and the pure, ugly luck of the thing chasing the loudest grief in the building. I was not the architect of our survival. I was just the man who happened to be crawling when the dice fell right. I got Nadia to the boiler room, and there we faced the last, worst arithmetic, because Silas was still slumped against the wall, still alive, still ruined. And there was only me to pull. And now two people who could not both be pulled at once, and a window of empty hallway that was closing with every second the thing spent finished with Doyle. Silas looked at his daughter. Nadia looked at her father. And Silas said the thing I'd been dreading since I first saw him in my headlamp. The thing I'd known was coming the way I know when ground is about to slide. "Take her," he said. "Don't come back for me." I did not obey him. I want that on the record, because so much of what I did in those days was cowardice dressed as pragmatism. And this once, exactly once, I chose the harder thing. I told Silas no. I told him I could take Nadia to the outfall and come back, that the hallway was empty, that there was time. He told me I was lying to make myself feel better, and that his leg would kill us both if I tried to drag him fast. Nadia knelt in the silt between us, the pipe still in her hands, and looked back and forth between the two men, arguing over which of them got to be responsible for her survival. And then she made the decision for both of us, the way she'd been making decisions all afternoon that the adults were too proud or too frightened to make. "Nobody's leaving him," she said. "You take him. I crawl behind you on my own. I don't need to be pulled. I'm not luggage." And before either of us could argue, she was already down in the outfall branch, already moving, forcing our hands. If she went alone, then I had to bring Silas, because a father does not stay behind while his child crawls into the dark unaccompanied. And she knew it, and she used it. 17 years old, and she outmaneuvered two grown men on strategy, while a corpse fed on the third man's screams down the hall. Getting Silas through that tunnel was the hardest physical thing I have ever done. And I will not pretend it was heroic, because heroism doesn't involve this much involuntary weeping. His ruined leg dragged. He bit down on his own belt to keep from crying out when the bone ground. Twice he passed out from the pain, and I had to keep moving his dead weight forward by sheer leverage. My back screaming, Nadia ahead of us calling directions in a whisper. And behind us, at the very edge of hearing, the sound of the thing losing interest in Doyle and beginning again, to wander, to listen, to hunt. We were 40 feet from the outfall when Silas's belt slipped and he made a sound. Not a scream, just a groan, low, involuntary, the sound a body makes when it can't help it. But in that silence, it was a gunshot. I felt the change in the air behind us, the way you feel a pressure drop before a storm. The thing in the halls above had heard, and now it was coming toward the boiler room, toward the tunnel mouth, toward the sound of a wounded man being dragged through the earth. I made the calculation in the space between heartbeats, and I hated every part of it. If I kept dragging Silas at the speed his body allowed, The thing would reach the tunnel before we reached the outfall. And it would come in after us. And in a 30-inch pipe, there is no fighting and no passing and no escape. It would take us in the order we lay. And Nadia was in front, which meant it would take Silas, then me, and reach her last, but reach her, unless someone made a louder sound somewhere else. I had the hand crank radio. I'd brought it clipped to my belt the whole time, an afterthought, dead weight, the tool that had saved me at the bunker. I could crank it, set it screaming, and shove it back down the tunnel toward the boiler room. And the thing that hunted by ear would go to the loudest thing in the dark. It would work. It had worked before. But the radio, once cranked and thrown, could not be retrieved. And the boiler room was where Silas's strength had run out. And I understood with a sick lurch that the radio wasn't the sacrifice. The radio was just noise. What the moment actually required was for someone to be the noise, moving, drawing the thing away on purpose while the others reached the light. Silas understood it before I finished thinking it. He always understood ground better than he let on. He grabbed my wrist with a grip that had swung a pick for 30 years, and he said very quietly, very clearly, "Give me the radio and cut me loose." And I knew what he meant. He meant he would crank it and drag his broken body back toward the boiler room, toward the thing, making all the noise a dying man could make, buying his daughter the seconds she needed. He meant to spend the last of himself as a diversion, and every instinct I'd been given by every survival story I'd ever consumed told me this was the noble answer, the correct answer, the answer that saved the most people. And I looked at Nadia's face in the dark, and I said no. Again, no. Refusing to let a man sacrifice himself is a strange kind of violence, because it means overruling the one autonomy a dying person has left. And I did it anyway, and I still don't know if it was love or arrogance. What I knew was this. I was tired of stories where the wounded man crawls into the dark alone so the young can live. I'd built my whole life around the belief that the smartest move was always the one that subtracted a person from the equation. Fewer people, fewer needs, less risk, my bunker for one, my silence, my grave I was proud of. Silas's offer was the same math I'd been doing my whole life, just wearing a hero's face. And I was done with that math. "There's a third way," I said, and I made myself believe it as I said it. The tunnel had a maintenance junction 10 feet back, a wider spot where an old sump pump sat rusting in a concrete pit. I'd noted it on the way in the way I note everything, filed it, moved on. A pit, a hole below the tunnel floor. If we could get Silas down into that pit and cover it, and if the thing came through the tunnel drawn by the radio I'd throw ahead of it toward the boiler room, then it would pass over Silas without finding him, because it hunted sound and stillness was invisible. And a man lying silent in a covered pit makes no sound at all. It was a gamble built on the one thing I actually understood, which was the behavior of the thing and the structure of the ground. Not heroics, physics and habit. We backed up to the junction, and I lowered Silas into the sump pit. He ground his teeth to powder not to cry out. And I dragged the rusted pump housing partly over the top, leaving a gap for air. And I told him the only job he had now was to be dirt, to be soil, to be the one thing in the world that makes no sound and asks for nothing, to not be noble, to just survive silently until I came back. Then I cranked the radio until my arm burned and I hurled it down the tunnel toward the boiler room. And it landed and screamed static into the dark. And I grabbed Nadia, and we crawled for the outfall, as behind us, the thing arrived at the tunnel mouth, and chose, as I'd bet my life it would, the loudest thing in the world, over the silent nothing lying in a pit 10 feet to its left. We came out into the creek bed and the daylight, and I pulled Nadia up, and we lay in the brush next to Eli and Ruth and gasped at the open sky. And for one moment, I let myself feel it, the animal relief of being above ground and alive. Then Nadia grabbed my collar and said, "You're going back for him." Not a question, a verdict. And I said yes, because I'd made it a plan instead of a sacrifice specifically so that going back would be possible. And now I had to be the kind of man who does the thing his plan requires instead of the kind who lets a good plan become an excuse. I went back into the tunnel a final time. Alone, no radio now, no tools, nothing but the dark and my hands. The static had died. The radio's crank charge run out, and the tunnel was silent. And I did not know if silence meant the thing had wandered off, or the thing was standing motionless somewhere in the black, waiting for me to make the sound that would end me. I crawled without light by memory, by the map in my head, and I have never in my life been so aware of my own breathing, so certain that the pull of air through my own throat was a bell announcing dinner. I reached the junction. I found the pump housing. I slid it back and put my hand into the pit and touched Silas's chest and felt it rise and fall, and I nearly wept with the relief of it. And then his hand closed over mine, and he whispered, "It came. It stood right here. I could smell it. I didn't move. He'd been dirt. He'd done the one thing I asked. And somewhere in the building above us, or the halls, or the dark, the thing that had passed over him was still out there. And I now had to drag this man the last 40 feet with no diversion left, no radio, no trick. Nothing but silence and speed and luck. While whatever hunted us listened for the smallest sound that would tell it we were alive. We made it out in silence so total, it became its own kind of scream. 40 feet of the most careful movement of my life. Silas biting his belt. Me distributing his weight across my back to keep his ruined leg from dragging. Both of us breathing through our noses in shallow sips. And the thing, somewhere, not finding us, because we gave it nothing to find. When I pushed Silas up out of the outfall into his daughter's arms, Nadia made a sound I'll hear for the rest of my life. A single broken exhale that had been held so long it had almost calcified. And she pulled her broken father into the brush and held his head against her chest. And did not cry loudly. Because even in relief, the girl understood that noise was death. We were 5 now. Me, Nadia, Silas, Ruth, and Eli, the boy who was counting to 100 and had reached 9,000. Doyle was gone. And I lay in the creek bed brush, looking at the 4 people I'd pulled from under a building, and I felt something I had spent $38,000 and a lifetime of careful subtraction, trying never to feel again, which was responsible for someone. It didn't feel like freedom. It felt like the opposite of the bunker. It felt like being findable. Ruth, the chemistry teacher with the steady hands, was the one who said what we were all avoiding. "We can't stay in a ditch," she whispered, "and we can't go back into the town." She looked at me with those level eyes that had lied so kindly to Doyle. "You built something, didn't you? That's why the girl came to find you. Everyone in the county heard about the man who spent a fortune putting a fort in the ground. And there it was, laid out in front of the exact people I'd built the bunker to exclude. My grave I was proud of, my hole for one. I want to tell you I offered it freely. I didn't. There was a full 3 seconds where the old arithmetic screamed in me. The bunker was provision for one man's supplies, one man's air, one man's silence. And 5 people would burn through all of it would turn my careful safety into a shared scarcity, would make my private survival into a public problem with an expiration date. I did the math I'd always done. 5 people, finite supplies, a countdown. And then I looked at Eli, still whispering numbers to himself. And I understood that the math was the disease. That I'd built my whole life around a subtraction that had made me a man who paid to disappear. And that the bunker had never once made me safe. It had only made me alone, which I'd confused with safe, because I'd never had the courage to tell the difference. "It's 9 miles," I said. "And it holds one comfortably. It'll be miserable for 5. I paused. "But it's dry, and it's hidden, and nothing that hunts by sound can hear you through 6 feet of engineered soil, because I built it to be the quietest place in the world." I looked at Silas, at the man who'd told me I'd dug a grave I was proud of. Turns out I built a grave, but it'll do for a house until we figure out something better. The drive back was slow and dark, and I won't pretend it was safe, because it wasn't. And we passed things in the road I won't describe, because describing them would be indulgence, and this is a confession, not a horror show. What I'll tell you is that somewhere in those 9 miles, the shape of the whole thing changed for me. I'd spent 5 days underground alone, before the world ended, and felt interred. And now, driving toward the same hole with 4 strangers who'd become the only people alive I cared about, I felt something the solitary version of me had never once felt in that concrete box. I felt like I was going home. We reached the access road at dusk. The static screaming decoy truck was still there, surrounded by the still standing shapes of the things that had gathered to its noise days ago, and simply stopped, wound down, waiting. I killed the diesel a 1/4 mile out, and we walked the last stretch in silence. Silas carried between me and Ruth, Nadia scouting ahead, Eli holding the hem of my jacket. And when I lifted the hatch on my $38,000 hole in the ground and lowered 4 other human beings into the silence I'd built for one, I understood that I'd finally spent the money on the thing I'd secretly wanted all along and been too much of a coward to name. Not a place to hide from people, a place to keep them. The first night with 5 people in a space built for one was a lesson in everything I'd gotten wrong about myself. I'd designed the bunker as a monument to not needing, and now every square foot of it argued against me. There was one cot. Silas got it. His leg splinted with survey stakes and ratchet straps by Ruth, who turned out to have been an army medic before she taught chemistry, a fact she'd never mentioned because, she said, people treat you different when they know you can hurt them competently. The rest of us slept on the floor in a warmth I'd spent a fortune trying to avoid. 5 bodies breathing the same recycled air, and I lay awake listening to it, the sound of other people existing, and found that it did not feel like a threat. It felt like the opposite of the pressure I'd felt that first solitary night. The silence had texture then. Now the not silence did. But I need to be honest about the fracture, because a confession that skips the fracture is just a brag. On the 3rd day underground, the arithmetic caught up with us the way it always does, and it caught up through Ruth, who was the only one besides me clear-eyed enough to run it. She found me at the air scrubber and told me, flatly, medic flatly, that Silas's leg was going septic, that the wound had turned, that without antibiotics stronger than the aspirin and expired amoxicillin in my one-man kit, the man who'd sacrificed nothing but was willing to sacrifice everything was going to die slowly in the quietest place in the world, and that his daughter was going to have to listen to it happen. There was a pharmacy in town. There was also, in town, the thing in the school, and however many others had joined it. And here was the dilemma that finally stripped the last of my careful clinical distance away. Because it wasn't a dilemma about strangers or math or subtraction. It was Nadia's father. The man who'd warned me. The man I'd carried through the earth. And going for the medicine meant leaving the bunker, breaking the perfect silence I'd built, becoming findable and loud and mortal again, in a world that punished all three. Nadia volunteered to go with me before I'd finished explaining. Of course she did. And this time, I didn't argue her down, didn't do the math that assigned her a safer role, because I'd finally learned that treating her like luggage was its own kind of insult, and because, frankly, she was better in the dark than I was. What I did instead was something the old me would have found incomprehensible. I asked the group. I put it to all 5 of us, the plan and the risk and the odds. And I let Silas, feverish, fading, honest, have a vote on whether we should risk 2 lives for his 1. He said no. He said let me go. And this time it was Ruth, not me, who overruled him. With a line I've kept. You don't get to vote yourself out of the world just because you're scared of costing us something. That's not nobility, Silas. That's the same cowardice this one had. She nodded at me. Just pointed inward instead of out. That sentence rearranged me. Because she was right. Silas's willingness to die for us and my determination to live for no one were the same disease wearing different masks. Both of us thought the answer to the terrible math of survival was to remove ourselves from the equation. Him by sacrifice, me by isolation. And both of us were wrong in the same direction. The answer was never subtraction. It was the horrible, dangerous, findable act of staying in the equation with other people and refusing to solve it by removing anyone at all. So Nadia and I went back into the world for her father's life. And we did it the way I'd learned to do everything now. Not by fighting the thing that hunted, but by understanding it, by routing sound, by being dirt when we had to be, and being fast when the window opened. I'll tell you how the pharmacy run went, because it's where the last piece of my transformation got hammered into place. And because it's where I finally understood what Nadia had known about me from the very first day, sitting on that tailgate doing math about a stranger. She'd looked at the loneliest man in the county and seen, before I did, that the only thing wrong with me was that I'd never once let myself be needed. And she'd decided that day that if the world ever ended, I was worth coming to find. The town at night was a held breath. Nadia and I moved through it the way I'd taught myself to move through everything now. Reading the ground. And the ground here told a grim story. The abandoned cars all pointed one way, the dark storefronts, and the things, the still standing things, scattered in the streets like poorly planted trees, motionless until sound moved them. We'd brought no radio this time. We'd learned. Silence was the only currency that spent well in this economy, and we were rich in it now, both of us. Moving heel to toe through the pharmacy's shattered front door into the chemical dark. Ruth had written the names of what we needed on my forearm in marker, because paper rustles and skin doesn't. Nadia held a penlight cupped in her fist, letting out slivers of light barely wider than a thread. And we read the shelves by that stingy glow while I filled a canvas bag with the specific salvation of a septic leg. It should have been simple. It was, for 6 minutes. And then Nadia's penlight caught something at the back of the pharmacy that stopped us both cold. And I understood that the story I'd been telling myself about this outbreak, that it was random, that it was luck, that Nadia's warning had been a daughter's intuition, was wrong in a way that changed everything. It was a whiteboard, the kind pharmacies use for schedules. And on it, in handwriting I recognized, because I'd watched a girl press it hard enough to tear paper, was a map, Nadia's map, of the county, with the school marked and the pharmacy marked, and my bunker marked. My hidden, secret $38,000 invisible bunker, marked with a small, careful X and a date. The date the crew had finished it. She'd been here. Days ago, before the school, before the tunnel. She'd stood in this pharmacy and drawn a map that included the location of a shelter she had no reason to know the exact position of, because I'd built it in secret. Because being unfindable was the entire point. "You knew where it was," I whispered. "Before. How did you—" And Nadia, in the dark of a looted pharmacy, with her father dying 9 miles away, told me the thing that reframed my whole confession. Her father, Silas, had walked the bunker site every day of the build. He was the foreman. He'd surveyed it, staked it, poured it. He knew its exact position down to the inch, and more than that, he'd understood something about the man who'd hired him that the man himself hadn't understood. "Dad said you built the safest place in the county, and then filled it with one person," which was the stupidest thing he'd ever seen a smart man do, she said. "He said if it ever went bad, that's where he'd bring people, because you'd built a lifeboat and tried to sail it alone. He marked it so we'd know where to go. He didn't send me to you because you were the only one who could get under the school. He sent me to you because he knew you'd never come out of that hole for yourself. You'd only come out for someone else." I stood in the dark and understood that I had been read. Not by an algorithm, not by a story, but by a man swinging a pick who'd looked at my grave I was proud of, and diagnosed the exact shape of my loneliness. And then, when the world ended, had bet his daughter's life on the theory that the only way to save the hermit was to make him necessary. Silas hadn't come to my bunker for shelter. He'd sent his daughter to my bunker to save me, by giving me people to save. The rescue I thought I'd performed had been, from the very first torn page, a rescue performed on me. We got out of the pharmacy clean, we got the medicine home, and the whole 9 miles back, in the dark, with the canvas bag of antibiotics between my feet and Nadia driving because her night vision was better. I turned it over and over. The enormity of having been seen so completely by a man I'd paid to dig me a hole to hide in. I'd thought the bunker was the thing I'd bought, but the thing I'd actually bought, without knowing it, was the attention of the one person perceptive enough to notice that a man who builds a shelter for one is a man asking, in the only language he has, to be found. Ruth got the antibiotics into Silas, and the fever broke on the second day, and I sat with him through the worst of it. The two of us in the small hours while the others slept. The foreman and the hermit he'd diagnosed. When he was lucid enough to talk, I told him I knew. I told him about the whiteboard, the map, what Nadia had said. I expected him to deny it, or soften it, or turn it into a joke the way men like us turn everything into jokes to survive being known. He didn't. He looked at me with his fever-bright eyes and said, "You spent 38 grand telling the whole county you wanted to be left alone." Loudest cry for help I ever heard. Somebody was going to answer it eventually. Turned out to be the apocalypse and me. I've thought a great deal about that sentence, the loudest cry for help he ever heard. Because he was right, and the rightness of it is the spine of everything I'm confessing. The bunker had never been about the end of the world. It had been about a man so afraid of needing people that he'd rather bury himself than risk being disappointed by them, and who'd made that burial elaborate and expensive precisely so that it would look like strength instead of the surrender it was. Silas had seen through the concrete to the frightened thing inside it, and instead of pitying me or leaving me to it, he'd made a plan to yank me out into the light, the only way I'd ever consent to be yanked, by putting someone in front of me who needed saving more than I needed hiding. the bunker held. That's the strange, quiet truth of those weeks. The thing I'd built to keep the world out kept 5 people alive. And it kept them alive, not because it was a fortress, but because it was silent. Because I'd engineered a place that made no sound in a world that hunted by ear. And my one genuine skill, reading and shaping the earth, turned out to be the one skill that mattered when the earth was the only thing between the living and the dead. I'd spent my life underground, professionally and emotionally, and it made me exactly the man 5 people needed. The tragedy and the comedy of it are the same tragedy and the same comedy. I'd developed every one of my abilities in the service of being alone, and every one of them turned out to be a gift for keeping others alive. We didn't stay in the bunker forever. I want to be clear that this isn't a story about a hole in the ground becoming a home in the sappy way those stories usually go. Because the hole was never meant for 5 and never would be. And a lifeboat is not a destination. What the bunker gave us was time. Time for Silas to heal. Time for Eli to speak again. Time for the 6 of us. We found a 6th, a woman named Priya, half-starved in a grain silo, drawn to us not by noise but by the smoke of the one careful fire we allowed ourselves. To become the thing that would actually save us, which was not a structure, but a group of people who had learned to trust each other's silences. When we left the bunker for good, it was on our terms, in daylight, moving toward a rumor Priya carried of a fortified grain cooperative 40 miles north where the living had gathered. We sealed the hatch behind us. I stood at the lip of it one last time, the grave I was proud of, and I felt none of the possessiveness I'd expected. It had done its job. Not the job I'd bought it for, not hiding me from the world, but the job it had somehow always been for, which was holding people safe long enough for one of them to learn how to belong to the others. Silas stood beside me, leaning on a survey stake I'd shaped into a cane, and he looked down at the sealed hatch and then out at the road north, and he said the last thing I'll record before the end of this, because it's the thing I carry. You know what the difference is between a grave and a bunker, Marcus? I said I didn't. He said, nothing. Same hole, same dark. The only difference is whether you climb back out and who's waiting when you do. Then he started up the road, his daughter on one side and the boy on the other. And I took one last look at the most expensive mistake I ever made. The mistake that saved my life by failing at everything I'd built it to do. The road north taught me the rest of what I needed to know. And it taught it the hard way, because the world between our bunker and the cooperative was not empty, and it did not care about my transformation. We moved as a unit now, and I was, to my continuing astonishment, the one the others looked to when the ground got uncertain. Not because I was brave, I've established at length that I'm not, but because I could read terrain and predict where the things would gather and where the silence would hold. The hermit skills in service of the group. Every mile north was a mile further from the man who'd paid to disappear. 20 miles in, we hit the reservoir. And the reservoir is where I want to end the account of our travels. Because it's where I finally paid the debt I'd been carrying since the tunnel. Since Doyle. Since the moment I understood that my survival had been luck dressed as cleverness. The bridge across the reservoir spillway was intact but exposed. A quarter-mile of open concrete with no cover. And on the far side, drawn by God knows what sound days or weeks ago, a crowd of the standing things had gathered and simply stopped, filling the far bridgehead like a congregation waiting for a sermon. We could not cross without noise. Noise would wake them, and there was no way around for 40 miles. The old me would have found the arithmetic, would have calculated who was expendable, who could serve as the diversion, who the group could afford to lose to buy the crossing. I know the old me would have, because I felt the old me reaching for the calculation, the familiar cold comfort of subtraction, and I refused it. I sat the group down in the cover of the tree line, and I said the thing I'd learned out loud to people I loved. We're not going to solve this by spending one of us. We solved the school by spending nobody, and we're going to solve this the same way. There's always a third path. We just have to be patient enough and quiet enough to find it. And we have to find it together, because 6 people see 6 things, and I only see the dirt. And we found it. It was Eli, of all of us, the boy who'd counted to 9,000, who saw it. The reservoir's water level was low, and the exposed mud flat below the spillway offered a path around the bridgehead, soft and silent and screened by the concrete abutment, invisible to the congregation of the dead above. A child found the third way, while the adults stared at the impossible bridge. We crossed on the mud in single file, in perfect silence, in the shadow of the very thing that should have killed us. And not one of us was spent, and not one of us was lost. And when we reached the far side and looked back at the crowd that had never so much as turned its head, I put my hand on Eli's shoulder and understood that I had finally, completely, become the opposite of the man who'd bought the bunker. Because the man who bought the bunker believed that safety was a thing you achieved by removing yourself from other people. And the man standing on the far side of the reservoir, with a mud-caked child and 5 other survivors, understood that safety, real safety, the only kind that had ever kept anyone alive in this new world, was a thing you built by refusing to remove anyone at all. 6 people, 6 kinds of sight, and a boy who saw the mud when the adults saw only the bridge. Subtraction had never once saved my life. Every time I'd lived, it had been because someone was added to the equation. Nadia's warning, Ruth's steadiness, Doyle's terrible accidental diversion, Eli's low eyes, Silas's diagnosis of my loneliness. I'd spent $38,000 trying to be the only variable. And the world had spent the apocalypse teaching me that the only variable that had ever mattered was the number of people I let myself need. We reached the cooperative on the 40th day. It was real. It held. There were 200 people behind its walls, and a wind turbine turning, and a school where Eli would learn to read again, and a clinic where Ruth would work, and a field where Silas, healed and limping, would foreman the digging of proper shelters. And there was a place for me, the man who read the ground, whose skills the settlement needed and used and valued. I had wanted once to be unfindable. I ended up being found and useful, and I'd known. And it was the first time in my adult life I understood the difference between hiding and being safe. I've been at the cooperative for 2 years now, and this confession is being written by lamplight in a room with a door I never lock, which is the truest measure of how far I've traveled from the man who spent a fortune on a hatch. But I owe you the harder part of the ending, the part that isn't redemption, because a confession that ends in clean redemption is just another lie. And I promised at the start I was done with those. Not everyone made it. And the person we lost in a way that put my whole transformation on trial and forced me to prove it was real and not just a story I'd told myself during a lucky stretch. It was Ruth, the chemistry teacher with the steady hands, the medic who'd overruled Silas, the woman who'd diagnosed my cowardice as the twin of his. She died in the settlement's second winter, not to the dead but to an infection of the ordinary kind, the kind medicine used to cure and now sometimes couldn't. And she died slowly, and she died knowing it. And in the dying, she asked me for something that tested every principle I'd built out of the tunnel and the school and the mud flat. She asked me not to spend the settlement's last dose of the one antibiotic that might have bought her a few more weeks. She wanted it saved for someone younger, someone with more road ahead. She wanted, in her last act, to subtract herself from the equation to preserve resources for the group. And I understood, holding her steady hand that was not steady anymore, that I was being asked to participate in the exact math I'd spent 2 years learning to refuse, the old arithmetic wearing the face of Ruth's generosity, the same way it had once worn the face of Silas's sacrifice. Save the dose, spend the person, solve the equation by removing someone. And I looked at the woman who had taught me that a person choosing to die for the group is committing the same sin as a person choosing to live for no one. And I did the hardest thing my transformation ever asked of me, which was to hold both truths at once, without collapsing into either. I gave her the dose, not because it would save her. Ruth was right, medically it wouldn't, and we both knew it. I gave it to her because refusing to let her subtract herself was the last gift I could give the woman who'd refused to let me subtract myself. I told her that her willingness to remove herself for the group was the same cowardice pointed inward that she'd once called out in Silas, that she didn't get to vote herself out of the world just because she was scared of costing us something. And I threw her own words back at her with tears running down my face, and she laughed, a real laugh, the last one. And she said, "You learned it. You actually learned it. God, it took the whole world ending, but you learned it." The dose bought her 9 days. We spent them talking. She was not alone when she went, and neither, for the first time in my remembered life, was I, even in grief. That's the part of the ending I need you to have, because it's where I finally understood the whole shape of what happened to me. The bunker didn't save me. Escaping the school didn't save me. Reaching the cooperative didn't save me. What saved me was learning, slowly and against every instinct I'd spent a lifetime building, that the answer to the terrible math of survival is not to find the person you can afford to lose. It's to look at the equation, at the resources and the risks, and the impossible arithmetic of who lives and who doesn't, and to refuse, every single time, with everything you have, to solve it by subtraction. Sometimes you fail. Ruth still died. Doyle still died. The refusal doesn't always work. But the refusal is the thing. The refusal is the whole of what separates a person from a calculation, a home from a bunker, a foreman's diagnosis from a foreman's grave. I keep the notebook, Nadia's notebook, the one with "Don't go home" torn into the page. She's 20 now, and she runs the settlement scouting parties, and she's better at reading the dead than I ever was at reading the ground. She gave the notebook to me on the first anniversary of the outbreak, and inside the front cover she'd written a new line, in handwriting that no longer had to press hard enough to tear the paper because she wasn't afraid anymore. It said, "You came out of the hole. That's all I ever needed you to do." Let me tell you what the bunker is now, because I went back once last spring. And the going back is the last thing I have to confess. Silas came with me, and Nadia, the 3 of us who'd been in the tunnel, driving the 40 miles south to the hole in the ground that started all of it. I don't fully know why I needed to see it again. Maybe because a man can't be sure he's escaped a grave until he stands at the edge of it and feels nothing pulling him down. Maybe because I wanted to prove to myself that the transformation was structural and not just a story, the way I'd once proven to bond committees that ground would hold weight before they built on it. The access road was overgrown. The decoy truck was still there, rusted, its radio long dead, and the standing things that had gathered to it were gone, wandered off or fallen, or simply wound down to nothing in the 2 years since. The field was quiet in the ordinary way now. Birds and wind. the world beginning the slow work of not caring that we'd nearly ended. And the hatch was where I'd left it, sealed. The $38,000 door to the safest, loneliest place in the county. I opened it. The air that came up was stale and dry and smelled of the epoxy I'd sealed the walls with. The exact smell of my first solitary night. And for a moment the old feeling reached up out of the dark and touched me. The pressure, the texture of the silence, the interred stillness of a man who'd bought a place to disappear. I stood at the lip, and I let myself feel it fully. The pull of it, the terrible seductive comfort of a place where no one could need me, and I could need no one. And then I felt Nadia's shoulder against my arm on one side, and Silas's on the other. Two people standing close enough to touch in a world that had taught us all that closeness was survival. And the pull let go. We didn't go down. There was no reason to. Instead, we did something better, something that made Silas laugh his low laugh, and made Nadia cry in the good way. We emptied it. We spent the whole day hauling everything usable up out of that hole and loading it into the truck for the cooperative. The tools, the seed stores, the sealed supplies, the air scrubber, the whole careful provision of a man who'd prepared to keep exactly one person alive. We gave it all to the 200. The bunker's contents became the settlement's spring planting and the settlement's medical shelf and the settlement's better ventilation. And the hole itself we left open, hatch propped wide so the dark could air out and the field could reclaim it. So it would stop being a grave and become just a low place in the ground where the rain would pool the way I'd always been able to predict rain would pool. Before we left, I stood at the open hatch one final time, and Silas came and stood beside me, and I told him the thing I'd been carrying the whole day, the thing that was really the point of driving 40 miles to look at an empty hole. I told him I understood now that I'd had the diagnosis backward for 2 years. I'd been telling myself the bunker failed at its job and saved me by accident, failed to hide me and so forced me into the world. But standing there, I finally saw it clearly. The bunker hadn't failed. It had done exactly what a shelter is supposed to do, which is keep people alive through the worst of it, and then let them leave when the worst has passed. The failure had never been in the bunker. The failure had been in the man who thought a shelter was for hiding in forever, instead of sheltering in until you could come out. I'd built the thing right. I'd just misunderstood, for 39 years, what it was for. The same way I'd misunderstood what I was for. Silas looked at the open hatch, at the dark airing out into the daylight, and he said, "Same hole, you climbed back out, and somebody was waiting." Then he clapped me on the shoulder with a hand that had swung a pick and staked a grave that became a house, and we got in the truck, and we drove north toward the settlement, and the 200 and the whole difficult findable business of being alive among other people. And I did not look back at the hole in the ground, because I finally, after everything, had somewhere better to look. I still read the ground. It's what I'm for. At the cooperative, I walk the perimeter each morning, and I read the soil the way I always have, where water wants to run, where the earth will hold, and where it will slide. And I use it to keep 200 people safe. And there is not a single day I don't feel the strange grace of a solitary skill turned toward the keeping of others. People here know my story now. They know I'm the man who spent $38,000 to disappear 5 days before the world made disappearing pointless. They tease me about it kindly, the way a community teases the people it has decided to keep, and I let them. Because the teasing is a kind of belonging, and I spent too long not belonging to be precious about how it arrives. What I've learned, the whole of it, the thing I'd tell the man standing at the mouth of his expensive grave, if I could reach back through time and shake him is this. The instinct to save yourself by removing yourself from other people is the same instinct as the wish to die. Both are subtraction. Both are a man solving the unbearable math of being alive by taking himself out of the equation, and the only answer that has ever worked, in the tunnel or the settlement or the ordinary grief of a chemistry teacher's last 9 days, is to refuse the subtraction, to stay in the equation, to be findable and needed and known and afraid and present. I built a place where no one could ever find me. Then a girl found me anyway, because her father knew that a man who hides that carefully is only asking to be found. I came out of the hole. It's all anyone ever needed me to do.